The chamber went silent the moment the vote counter stopped moving. Every light on the display turned red. I stood there, alone at the human podium, while 11 alien delegations stared down at me like judges waiting to hear a prisoner beg. The vote was final. The Galaxy Council had just declared war on Earth. I felt my own heartbeat slow down instead of speed up. Strange, I know. Any sane person should have felt fear in that moment. Instead, I felt something closer to relief. The waiting was finally over. My name is Elias Reyes. I am a commander in the Earth Defense Fleet, but that day, I was wearing a diplomat's uniform, sitting in a chair meant for a species the Council considered young, loud, and dangerous. They were right about two of those three things. The delegate from the Vashtar cluster rose first. His skin shimmered pale blue under the chamber lights, and his voice carried the practiced calm of someone who had never lost anything important in his life. He looked at me the way you look at an insect that wandered onto your dinner table. "Commander Reyes," he said, "your people have refused inspection of a colony vessel in a contested zone. Your government has ignored 7 formal warnings. The Council views this as open defiance of galactic law. Effective immediately, a state of conflict exists between the Council fleet and the human systems." He paused, waiting for me to break, waiting for tears, or anger, or some clumsy human outburst he could report back to his people as proof that we were exactly as unstable as they believed. I smiled instead. It was not a big smile. Not a smirk, not a challenge. Just a small, quiet smile, the kind you give when someone tells you news you already expected. But in that chamber, full of species who had not fought a real war in centuries, that smile landed like a slap. The Vashtar delegate blinked. His aide leaned over and whispered something. Across the room, the Farron ambassador, a tall insectoid being with compound eyes that never seemed to blink, tilted her head at me the way a bird studies something it does not understand. "You find this amusing, Commander?" the Vashtar delegate asked. "No," I said. "I find it expected." A murmur rolled through the chamber. I could see confusion spreading faster than any translator could keep up with it. These were beings who had built their entire civilization around avoiding conflict. Their wars, if you could even call them that, were fought with lawyers and trade embargoes. Actual combat, actual loss of life, had become something they read about in history books written 1,000 years ago. They had never seen a species that did not flinch at the word war. I want to take you back just for a moment to understand why I was not afraid. Because this moment in the chamber, the one that would later be replayed across 1,000 worlds, did not happen by accident. It was the result of nearly 30 years of quiet, careful work that most of humanity itself did not even know about. When we first made contact with the Council, back when I was still a boy watching the broadcasts with my family in our small house outside Lahore, we were told a simple story. The galaxy was peaceful. Advanced civilizations had grown beyond the need for war. We were the newest, smallest, most primitive voice at the table, and we should be grateful for the seat we were given. It took my government exactly 4 months to realize that story was not true. The Council was peaceful the way a wolf pack is peaceful when it has already eaten. Every powerful species at that table had fought its wars centuries ago, had settled its borders through force long before humanity ever launched a rocket, and now enjoyed pretending that peace was simply their nature, rather than the result of old, brutal victories. They looked down on newer species, not because they were wiser, but because they had already taken everything they wanted and could afford to call it enlightenment. Earth's leaders understood something the Council never expected us to understand so quickly. If the galaxy truly ran on strength, then a young species that refused to plan for conflict would eventually be erased or absorbed. So while our ambassadors smiled and nodded in council meetings, our engineers, our soldiers, and our scientists were doing something else entirely. We were getting ready. I did not know most of this when I was young. I only knew that my older sister Nora joined the Fleet Academy the year I turned 16, and that she came home during holidays quieter than before, her hands calloused in ways that made no sense for someone who was supposedly just studying navigation. It was only after I joined the service myself that I understood what was really happening. Earth had spent 3 decades building something no other council species had bothered to build in a very long time. Not just ships, not just weapons. We built people who were not afraid to lose. I remember the day Nora came home for good, before her final posting to the border fleet. We sat on the back porch of our parents' house, the evening sky turning orange over the fields, and she told me something I never forgot. She said the Council species trained their pilots to avoid damage above all else, because losing a single ship was treated as a tragedy worth mourning for years. Our instructors trained us differently. They taught us that loss was part of the plan, that you could not win a real fight if you spent the entire battle protecting yourself instead of finishing the job. It sounded harsh when she said it. It sounds even harsher now, sitting in that chamber, knowing the fight was finally here. I thought about that conversation while I gathered my papers from the podium. Around me, aides from other delegations hurried past, careful not to meet my eyes, as if defiance might be something you could catch like a cold. I did not blame them. Their whole lives had been built on the idea that this council chamber was the safest place in the galaxy, a room where words replaced weapons and disagreements were solved with patience rather than force. I had just proven, with nothing more than a small smile, that the room was not as safe as they believed. Outside the chamber, the corridors of the council station stretched in every direction, lined with tall glass windows looking out over 100 different starlit worlds. I walked slowly, in no hurry to reach my shuttle, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into my chest. War. Real war. Not a border argument resolved by trade sanctions, not a disagreement settled by a panel of judges. Ships. Losses. Families waiting for messages that might never come. And yet, beneath all of that weight, there was something else. A strange, steady calm that came from knowing we had not been caught off guard. For 30 years, while alien diplomats debated trade routes and mining rights, our engineers had studied every piece of council technology we were allowed to see, and quite a few pieces we were not supposed to see at all. Our shipyards near Jupiter had been quietly upgrading old designs with new ideas, blending council engineering with human stubbornness. Our training academies had stopped teaching young pilots to fear failure, and started teaching them to expect it, plan for it, and move through it anyway. A young Farron aide caught up to me near the transport bay, her 4 narrow legs clicking softly against the polished floor. She hesitated before speaking, her antennae twitching with what I now understood to be nervous energy. "Commander," she said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. "Why did you smile, in there, when the vote was read?" I considered the question carefully before answering. It was, in some ways, the most important question anyone would ask me that day. Because for 30 years, my people have been told we are too young, too reckless, and too small to matter, I said. And today, your council finally admitted the only thing it has left to offer us is fear. That tells me everything I need to know about how this will end. She did not respond. She simply stood there, watching me walk toward my shuttle, her antennae still trembling slightly in the recycled air of the station. Back in the chamber, the Vashtar delegate cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "The council fleet will move against your border systems within the cycle," he said. "You may wish to return home and prepare your people for what is coming." "I appreciate the warning," I said, "though I suspect you are more worried about what is coming than we are." That was the moment the room truly turned against me. Delegates from 4 different worlds began speaking at once, their translators overlapping into a mess of static and half-formed insults. The Farron ambassador raised a limb for silence, and slowly the noise died down. "You mock us," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something I recognized as the first thread of doubt. "I am not mocking you," I said. "I am telling you the truth. Your council has fought no real war in longer than my entire species has existed. You have simulations, you have theories. We have neither the luxury nor the desire for either. We simply prepare, and when the moment comes, we act." I could see it then, the flicker behind her compound eyes. Not fear exactly, something closer to the first crack in a wall that had stood for a very long time. The session ended shortly after that. There were no more speeches, no more formal declarations, just the quiet shuffle of alien bodies leaving the chamber, each species retreating to their private chambers to discuss what had just happened. I stayed behind for a moment, alone in the great hall, looking up at the massive dome ceiling painted with the symbols of 100 different worlds. Earth's symbol was near the very edge, small and simple, added only a few decades ago. I remember thinking that soon, one way or another, that symbol would not be small anymore. My communicator buzzed. It was Grace Whitfield, our senior fleet strategist back on Earth, the woman who had spent the last 20 years turning old warnings into real plans. They declared it, I said, before she could ask. Good, Grace said, and I could hear the small, tired smile in her voice. Come home, Elias. We have work to do. I looked one last time at the empty chamber, at the seats still warm from anger and confusion, and I let myself smile again. Not because I wanted this war. No one on Earth wanted it. We had spent 3 decades hoping it would never come. But if it had to come, I would rather it come now, on our terms, with our preparation, against an enemy who still believed that fear was something only young species felt. They had declared war on humanity. We had been ready for a very long time. 3 days after the declaration, I stood inside a briefing room on the Council flagship Aurelia, invited there under the strange rules of pre-war courtesy that the Council still insisted on following. Even at the edge of conflict, they wanted to show me their confidence, as if letting me see their strength might convince Earth to surrender before a single shot was fired. The room was shaped like a wide bowl, with a massive holographic display floating at its center. Fleet commanders from 6 different species stood around it, studying projections of human border systems glowing in soft blue light. None of them looked at me the way soldiers look at an enemy they respect. They looked at me the way you look at a puzzle you have already solved. A tall commander named Doran Vec, broad-shouldered and pale gray-skinned, stepped forward to address the room, though his words were clearly meant for me. Our models are simple, he said. Humanity has one significant shipyard cluster, a defense fleet roughly 1/3 the size of our advance force alone, and no meaningful alliances beyond your own solar system. Your species has existed as a star-faring civilization for less than a century. We have refined fleet doctrine for 1,000 years. He gestured, and the display shifted to show projected fleet strength, a wall of green numbers representing council ships against a much smaller cluster of human vessels. It was meant to be intimidating. In truth, it told me exactly how little they actually knew about us. You believe numbers alone win wars, I said. Numbers, experience, and technology, Doran Vec replied. 3 things your species lacks. I let his words sit in the air for a moment before responding. You have refined fleet doctrine for 1,000 years, fighting simulations and border disagreements settled by treaties. We have refined survival for 100,000 years, fighting wars on our own world, against our own kind, with far less advanced tools than you carry today. Experience is not measured only in centuries. It is measured in what a people are willing to endure. Doran Vec's expression did not change, but I noticed the slight shift in his stance, the same small crack of doubt I had seen in the Farron ambassador back at the council chamber. These were beings who had never truly needed to endure anything. Their wars, when they happened at all, were brief and heavily regulated, fought under strict rules, meant to minimize suffering on both sides. It was almost admirable in its own way. It was also, I knew, their greatest weakness. I was allowed to observe 2 more briefings before my return to Earth, and each one reinforced the same pattern. The council commanders spoke of humanity the way a scientist speaks of a lab result they already expect. They discussed our supposed weaknesses with total certainty. Small fleet size, limited experience with true interstellar combat, no known alliances strong enough to matter, predictable tactics based on outdated doctrine they had observed during minor border patrols years earlier. What they never discussed, because they simply did not know, was what Earth had actually been doing during those 30 years of quiet diplomacy. When I returned home, Grace Whitfield met me at the shuttle bay beneath our primary command station, hidden deep in the asteroid belt where Council sensors had difficulty reaching. She had been with the defense program since before I joined, one of the original architects of what we now called the Long Patience Plan. She looked older than I remembered, the lines around her eyes deeper, but her handshake was as firm as ever. Tell me what you saw, she said, walking briskly through the station corridors, past engineers and analysts who barely looked up from their screens. They think our fleet is 1/3 the size of their advance force, I said. Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile. 1/3 of what they can see. We reached the central command hall, a vast chamber built into the rock itself, lit by soft blue panels that mimicked Earth's daytime sky. Holographic displays lined the walls, showing fleet positions across dozens of systems most of the Council had never surveyed closely. I saw ship designations I did not recognize, numbers far higher than anything listed in our official reports to the Council. How long have we been hiding this? I asked. Long enough, Grace said. You know the story we tell the Council. Small colonial fleet, limited industrial base, barely capable of defending our own systems. It was never entirely a lie. It was simply an old truth we let them keep believing, long after it stopped being accurate. She led me to a display showing our shipyards, not just the well-known facility near Jupiter, but a dozen others scattered across asteroid fields and hidden lunar bases the Council had never bothered to inspect closely, believing our industrial capacity too small to be worth watching. Each yard had spent years quietly building and modifying vessels, using a mixture of human engineering and technology, carefully studied from decommissioned Council ships purchased through independent traders who never asked too many questions. We are still smaller than their full fleet, Grace admitted. But we are not 1/3 their size. We are closer to 2/3, and every ship we have was built with their weaknesses in mind. I thought about something else Doran Vec had said, about humanity having no meaningful alliances. I asked Grace about it directly. That part is not entirely wrong yet, she said, but it will not remain true for long. She showed me another display, this one mapping relationships with smaller species scattered across contested regions of Council space. The Ashen Collective, a quiet, technologically skilled people who had been denied full Council membership for generations despite meeting every requirement on paper. The Meridian Trade Guild, an independent group of merchants and engineers who had grown wealthy trading with humanity precisely because we treated them as equals rather than lesser partners. Several smaller colonies who had watched the Council ignore their grievances for decades while offering endless sympathy and no actual help. We have not built alliances through treaties and speeches, Grace said. We built them through decades of fair trade, shared technology, and simple respect, something the Council has never bothered to offer species it considers beneath itself. I understood, then, why humanity had smiled when the war was declared. It was not arrogance. It was the quiet confidence of a people who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this moment, while their enemies spent those same 30 years assuming preparation was unnecessary. That evening, I visited the training decks where new pilots ran through combat simulations designed by veterans who had fought in Earth's own conflicts long before any of us had seen the stars. I watched a young pilot named Daniel Okafor run through a boarding simulation, his movements sharp and deliberate, his mistakes corrected instantly by an instructor who did not soften her criticism to protect his feelings. "You froze for half a second," she told him. "Half a second is someone's life." Daniel nodded, reset the simulation, and ran it again without complaint. I watched a dozen more pilots go through similar drills. Each one pushed past the point of comfort. Each one taught that failure was not something to fear, but something to learn from quickly and move past. This was the difference the Council would soon discover for themselves. Their pilots trained to avoid mistakes entirely, treating each simulated loss as evidence of poor design or poor judgment. Ours trained to survive mistakes, to keep functioning even when a plan fell apart halfway through execution, because we understood something they had forgotten centuries ago. No plan survives contact with a determined enemy. What matters is what you do after the plan breaks. Before that briefing, I made one more stop, this time to the veterans' quarters near the lower deck of the station, where retired soldiers now worked as instructors and advisors for the younger generation. I found Owen Bellamy there, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who had fought in 3 separate conflicts on Earth long before humanity ever built its first starship. He was teaching a small group of officers how to read a battlefield without relying on sensors, using nothing but instinct, sound, and the small details most people never bothered to notice. "Commander Reyes," he said, noticing me by the doorway. "Come to see how the old-timers do it?" "Something like that," I said. He waved me over, and I watched him walk his students through an old exercise, one I recognized from my own early training. He described a scenario, a narrow corridor, limited visibility, an enemy who might be waiting around any corner, and asked his students to explain how they would move through it. Their answers were careful, methodical, built on the assumption that careful planning could remove all risk from the situation. Owen listened patiently, then shook his head. "None of you will survive that corridor," he said, not unkindly, "because you are all planning for the fight you expect, not the fight you will actually get. The moment you enter that corridor, your plan changes. Something always changes. The question is not whether your plan will survive contact. It never does. The question is whether you will." I remembered him giving me nearly the same lesson years earlier, back when I was young enough to believe that enough preparation could guarantee an outcome. It took me several difficult lessons of my own to understand what he meant. The Council fleet, for all its numbers and history, had never truly learned that lesson, because they had never needed to. Every conflict they engaged in was carefully managed, heavily regulated, designed from the start to minimize uncertainty. They had built an entire civilization around avoiding the one thing that made a soldier truly capable, and that was learning to function when everything fell apart around you. "They are going to send trained crews against us," Owen said, as if reading my thoughts. "Good crews, disciplined crews, following doctrine that has worked for them for centuries, but discipline built entirely on order breaks the moment the order disappears. That is where we will win this." I left the veterans' quarters and made my way to a smaller meeting room where Grace was finishing a private conversation over a secure channel. I waited outside until she finished, and when she stepped out, she looked satisfied in a way I had not seen in days. "That was the Ashen Collective," she said. "They have agreed to open 2 of their border relay stations to our fleet if the Council pushes further into contested space. It is not a formal alliance. Their leadership is still too cautious for that, but it is enough to matter." "And the Meridian Trade Guild?" I asked. "Already committed," she said, quietly. "Of course. They have spent decades building trade routes with human colonies, and they have no interest in watching the Council absorb those colonies and cut them out of the profits. Self-interest can be a very reliable form of loyalty, Elias, sometimes more reliable than genuine friendship." I thought about how strange it was, standing in a hidden command station built into an asteroid, discussing alliances with species the Council considered too small and too insignificant to matter, knowing that those same alliances might tip the balance of an entire war. The Council had spent so long looking down on smaller civilizations that they never noticed how many quiet relationships those civilizations had built with each other, relationships built without the Council's knowledge or approval. Later that night, Grace called a full briefing for the senior command staff, myself included. She stood at the head of a long table, the same steady calm in her voice that I remembered from years of smaller crises. "The Council fleet will move against our border systems within days," she said. "Their models say we will fall within the first few engagements. They believe our fleet is small, our tactics outdated, and our alliances non-existent. We are going to let them keep believing all 3 things for as long as possible. And when they stop believing it," asked a young officer near the end of the table. "By then," Grace said, "it will already be too late for them to change their strategy." I left that briefing thinking about Doran Vek's confident wall of green numbers, the careful projections built on decades of outdated intelligence. I thought about the smile I had given the Council chamber, and how little they understood about what that smile actually meant. They believed war was a matter of numbers and experience. We understood it was a matter of will, and for the first time in a very long while, humanity was about to show the galaxy exactly how much of that we truly had. The alarm woke me before the message even finished arriving. 6 hours after that final briefing, the Council fleet crossed into the border system we called Halden's Reach, a quiet cluster of mining colonies and one modest shipyard that nobody outside our own command structure believed was worth defending seriously. That was exactly why we chose it as our first battlefield. I reached the command deck of our lead cruiser, a vessel we called the Meridian Dawn, just as the sensor operators finished confirming the scale of the incoming fleet. Doran Vek had brought exactly what his briefings promised: A wall of ships arranged in the same tight, disciplined formation the Council had used for centuries, designed to project overwhelming strength and encourage quick surrender. 32 capital ships, said Lara Ferris, our sensor chief, her voice steady despite the number. Escort craft numbering somewhere near 200. They are broadcasting a surrender request on all channels. Of course they are, I muttered. Grace stood beside me, her eyes fixed on the tactical display, watching the Council formation approach with the patience of someone who had waited 30 years for this exact moment. Let them broadcast, she said. Hold formation. Let them think we are considering it. Our own fleet, spread across the system in a pattern that looked disorganized to any sensor built on Council doctrine, waited quietly among the asteroid fields and hidden relay stations Grace had spent years preparing. To Doran Vex scanners, we appeared exactly as weak as his briefings had described. 16 visible capital ships, scattered and poorly positioned, exactly the kind of force he expected to fold within the first exchange. What his scanners could not see were the additional 40 ships hidden inside the asteroid field itself. Engines cold, sensors passive, waiting for a single signal. The surrender request repeated 3 times before Doran Vex's fleet began to advance. I watched the formation tighten as it crossed the outer marker of the system, moving with the calm confidence of a force that had never needed to consider the possibility of real resistance. They are entering weapons range, Laura said. Let them, Grace replied. Elias, signal Daniel's squadron. It is time. I sent the order myself, a short encrypted burst, directed toward a cluster of small, fast vessels positioned along the edge of the mining colony's shipping lanes. These were not warships in the traditional sense. They were converted mining haulers and cargo ships, retrofitted over the past year, with weapons systems designed to look like standard civilian equipment on any Council scanner. Doran Vex's fleet had scanned this system a dozen times over the past decade during routine patrols, and every scan showed the same peaceful mining operation. Nobody had bothered to update those scans recently. Daniel Okafor's voice came through the channel, calm despite the weight of what he was about to do. Squadron ready, Commander. Execute, I said. What happened next was not the kind of battle the Council had trained for. Daniel's converted haulers moved not toward the main Council formation, but past it, weaving through the mining colony's normal shipping routes exactly as they had 1,000 times before. To Council sensors, nothing appeared unusual, until those same haulers opened fire on the formation's rear support ships from point-blank range, their weapons cutting through shields designed to withstand frontal assaults from recognized warships, not surprise strikes from vessels registered as civilian cargo haulers. 3 Council support ships lost power within the first minute. Not destroyed, simply disabled. Engines and weapons systems overloaded by a targeted strike our engineers had spent months designing specifically to exploit a weakness in Council shield configuration we had studied from purchased decommissioned hardware. They are reacting, Laura reported, watching the Council formation begin to break apart in confusion. Rear guard turning to engage the haulers. Main formation slowing. Now, Grace said, bring the fleet forward, full engagement. Our 16 visible ships surged out from their positions, and for the first time, Doran Vex's fleet saw what they believed was the entirety of humanity's defense force moving to meet them head-on. It looked, by Council standards, like a desperate and poorly coordinated response from an outmatched defender. Exactly what they expected. The 40 ships hidden in the asteroid field remained silent and cold, waiting. I watched the tactical display as our visible fleet engaged the Council's main formation, trading fire in patterns that looked chaotic compared to the tight, practiced volleys of the Council ships. Our pilots pushed closer than Council doctrine considered safe, closer than their training told them any experienced crew should risk, because our training had taught us something different. Distance favored the side with better shields and heavier weapons. Closeness favored the side willing to take more risk. A young pilot named Claire Whitmore flew her fighter directly between 2 Council escort vessels, close enough that both ships hesitated to fire for fear of striking each other, and used that hesitation to disable one of their targeting arrays with a precise strike before pulling away. It was the kind of maneuver no sane Council pilot would attempt, because it violated every rule about maintaining safe engagement distance. It was also exactly the kind of maneuver our training academies had spent years teaching, because sanity, in this case, was a luxury we could not afford. Commander Vec is adjusting formation, Laura reported. He is pulling ships back to reduce exposure. Good, Grace said quietly. That is exactly what we want. As the Council formation pulled back and tightened, consolidating their ships into a smaller, more defensible cluster, they inadvertently created exactly the kind of concentrated target our hidden fleet had been waiting for. Grace gave the signal, and 40 ships that had spent the entire battle sitting silent and cold within the asteroid field suddenly came alive, engines flaring, weapons charging, moving to strike the newly consolidated Council formation from an angle their sensors had never been watching. The look on Doran Vec's face, captured later by one of our reconnaissance drones and shared throughout the fleet as a small, quiet morale boost, was one of pure confusion turning rapidly into alarm. His formation, which moments before had represented overwhelming strength, was now caught between two forces, one it had already engaged and underestimated, and one it had never known existed at all. They are requesting emergency reinforcement, Laura said, a note of disbelief in her voice. Their command ship is broadcasting an open distress signal. I felt something settle in my chest, not triumph exactly, but a quiet confirmation of everything Grace and Owen and every veteran instructor back on Earth had spent decades preparing us to believe. The Council fought wars the way you fight a fire drill, following careful steps designed to minimize risk and confusion. We fought wars the way you fight for your life, adapting instantly to whatever the moment required. While our haulers struck the rear support ships and our visible fleet held the main formation in place, a third element of our plan was already unfolding, one that even I had not fully appreciated until Laura began reading updates from a separate channel entirely. A small team led by a former colonial security officer named Henry Ashworth had spent the past 6 months training for something the Council had never once considered possible: boarding a capital ship mid-battle rather than simply trying to destroy it. Their target was one of the disabled support ships, its shields down after the hauler strike, its crew still recovering from the shock of losing power in the middle of what they believed was a controlled, low-risk engagement. Henry's team crossed the gap between our lines and the drifting Council vessel using small, unpowered transport pods designed specifically to avoid detection by active sensors, a technique borrowed from old submarine tactics that Council engineers had never needed to develop, since none of their conflicts in living memory had ever required boarding an active enemy vessel. When Henry's team cut through the outer hull and entered the ship, they found a crew still following emergency protocols meant to manage power failures, not repel intruders. They were not ready for us, Henry reported later, his voice calm over the comm despite everything that had happened. Their training assumes an enemy will either destroy a ship or accept its surrender. Nobody prepared them for someone climbing through the hull while the fight was still happening around them. Henry's team secured the ship's command deck within minutes, disabling its remaining systems and taking its senior officers into custody, without further loss of life on either side, a detail Grace insisted on emphasizing in every report we sent back to Earth. We were not interested in cruelty. We were interested in proving a point, and that point was made clearly enough without needing to go further than necessary. Meanwhile, our electronic warfare teams, operating from a hidden relay station disguised as an old communications relay left over from the mining colony's early days, spent the entire battle quietly working through the Council fleet's communication protocols we had studied for years through intercepted transmissions and purchased hardware. By the middle of the engagement, our teams had successfully disrupted coordination between several Council escort squadrons, feeding them delayed or slightly altered tactical information that made their formation adjustments arrive just a few crucial seconds too late to matter. It was not a single decisive stroke that won that battle. It was dozens of small advantages, layered one on top of another, each one exploiting an assumption the Council had never bothered to question. They assumed civilian vessels were harmless. They assumed a disabled ship was no longer a threat worth guarding closely. They assumed their communication protocols were secure, simply because no species had ever seriously tried to break them before. Humanity had spent 30 years quietly proving every one of those assumptions wrong, and Halden's Reach was where we finally showed our work. The battle that followed lasted less than 2 hours, though it felt considerably longer from the command deck. I watched our converted haulers continue their disruptive strikes against the Council's rear support, watched our visible fleet hold the Council's main formation in place through aggressive, close-range engagement that violated every rule of safe distance their doctrine relied upon, and watched our hidden reserve fleet strike the consolidated formation from an angle they never accounted for. We lost ships. I want to be honest about that because it matters. 2 of our visible cruisers took damage severe enough to require immediate evacuation, and I heard the names of the crew members lost that day repeated quietly in briefings for weeks afterward. War, even a war we were prepared for, was never going to be without cost, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never actually fought one. But the Council lost far more. By the time BackHFY issued the order to withdraw what remained of his formation, 7 of his 32 capital ships had been destroyed outright, another 11 disabled beyond immediate repair, and dozens of escort craft scattered or damaged across the system. It was not a total victory. It was not the end of the war, but it was enough to prove something the Council had never believed possible, that humanity could meet their advance force head-on and force them to retreat. I stood on the command deck as the last Council ships pulled back across the system boundary, watching the tactical display slowly clear of red markers. Grace stood beside me, her expression unreadable, though I noticed her hands were shaking slightly, the only sign of the tension she had carried through the entire engagement. "We held," I said. "We held," she agreed. "But this was their advance force, Elias. Their probe. They sent this fleet expecting an easy surrender, not a real fight. Their main force is still out there, and now they know we can hurt them." I understood what she meant. BackHFY's fleet had come expecting to overwhelm a weak, disorganized defender, and instead had run directly into a force that fought smarter, adapted faster, and refused to break even when the numbers seemed to favor the Council on paper. That kind of shock does not simply fade after one battle. It spreads, through command structures, through fleet briefings, through every future decision the Council would make about how seriously to take humanity as a threat. Before Laura's report reached us, I made my way down to the medical deck, wanting to see for myself the cost of what we had just accomplished. The corridors were busy with medical staff moving quickly between rooms, and I found Daniel Okafor sitting on the edge of a cot, a bandage wrapped around his arm, watching quietly as a nurse checked the readings on a monitor beside him. "You look better than I expected," I said. Daniel managed a tired smile. "Lost 2 ships from my squadron. Good crews. I keep thinking about what I could have done differently." I sat down beside him, choosing my words carefully. Owen Bellamy told a group of young officers something a few days ago. He said no plan survives contact, and the question is never whether the plan survives, but whether you do. You survived, Daniel, and so did most of your squadron. That is not failure. That is the plan working exactly as it was meant to. He nodded slowly, though I could see the weight still sitting behind his eyes. That weight, I knew, would never fully disappear. Not for him, not for any of us. War asked a price of everyone who fought in it, regardless of how well prepared they were, and I had learned long ago that pretending otherwise did nothing but dishonor those who paid that price. I moved further down the medical deck and found Claire Whitmore recovering from a minor injury sustained during her closest pass between the 2 Council escort vessels. Her fighter's hull scorched along one side from a shot that had come far closer than any safety margin should have allowed. "They will be studying that maneuver for years," I told her. "They can study it all they like," Claire said, wincing slightly as she shifted position. "Doesn't mean they will be able to fly it. Takes more than knowing the plan, Commander. Takes knowing you are willing to lose the ship to make it work." Her words stayed with me long after I left the medical deck, because they captured something essential about the difference between our fleet and the one we had just fought. The Council could study our tactics, could analyze every maneuver, every strike pattern, every piece of retrofitted technology we had used against them, and still fail to replicate what we had done, because the tactics themselves were never the true advantage. The willingness behind them was. By the time I returned to the command deck, Laura had gathered a growing collection of intercepted Council transmissions, and Grace was reviewing them with the same careful attention she gave every piece of intelligence that crossed her desk. Doran Vek's own report to Council Command is remarkably honest, Grace said, gesturing toward the display. He describes our tactics as, and I am translating loosely here, unpredictable, aggressive beyond acceptable risk tolerance, and difficult to counter using standard doctrine. He is not wrong, I said. He also requests reinforcement before attempting any further advance into human space, Grace continued. Which means Council Command now has a choice to make. Send a larger force immediately and risk an even more embarrassing defeat if we have prepared surprises for that as well, or pause, reassess, and give humanity time to prepare even further defenses. Which do you think they will choose? I asked. Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering. I think, Elias, that for the first time in longer than any of us have been alive, the Council is going to discover what it feels like to be afraid of losing something they always assumed was already theirs. Word of Halden's reach spread faster than even Grace had predicted. Within a week, I found myself summoned to a private meeting far from the Council chamber, on a neutral trading station orbiting a dim red star at the edge of contested space. The invitation came from a representative of the Ashen Collective, the same quiet, technologically skilled people who had already agreed to open their relay stations to our fleet. Their representative, a soft-spoken woman named Iris Thalen, met me in a small private lounge overlooking the station's central docking bay. She was not a diplomat in the traditional sense, more of a senior engineer who had been given authority to speak for her people in matters that required careful trust rather than formal ceremony. Your victory at Halden's Reach has caused a great deal of conversation among my people, she said, pouring 2 cups of a pale, fragrant tea that I did not recognize. For generations, we have watched the Council deny our membership petitions again and again, always citing some new requirement we had somehow failed to meet, no matter how thoroughly we prepared. We began to believe there was no version of ourselves the Council would ever consider equal. And now, I asked? Now we watch a species far younger than ourselves refuse to accept that same judgment, Iris said. You did not simply survive the Council's attack. You embarrassed them in front of the entire galaxy. That is not something my people have ever seen before, and it has made many of our leaders reconsider exactly how much power the Council truly holds over any of us. She explained, carefully and without exaggeration, that several Ashen Collective leaders were now prepared to move beyond quiet cooperation into something closer to open partnership, provided humanity was willing to treat them as genuine equals rather than simply useful allies for the duration of the war. I assured her, as honestly as I could, that Earth had no interest in replacing one hierarchy of contempt with another. We are not fighting this war to become the next Council, I told her. We are fighting it because we refuse to be told our existence requires their permission. Iris studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the way that made me wonder how much of human diplomacy still felt foreign to her, despite her fluent understanding of our language. Finally, she nodded. That is the answer my leadership was hoping to hear. Before I left that meeting, she shared something else, information that would prove far more valuable than any formal treaty. The Council leadership itself was beginning to fracture over how to respond to Halden's Reach. Several senior members, representing older, more cautious species, were pushing for immediate escalation, a larger fleet, a faster campaign, before humanity's reputation could spread any further